let's get to the reason we're here tonight. I'm super excited to introduce Sachin Rekhi. He is founder and CEO of NoteJoy. And that's like just one of several. He's a true entrepreneur. Looking through his LinkedIn background, he did spend time at LinkedIn as the head of product for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, which is a tool I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. He was a founder at anywhere.com. He's a founder at and CEO of a couple other startups as well. Earlier, he was a PM at Microsoft, which is a great place to, or start your career and learn PM. The biggest thing, if you haven't discovered already, is to go to his website, sachinrekhi.com. He has over 150 essays, right? He is very generous in sharing his advice and knowledge. He has over 150 essays there on his website. He has a newsletter. And again, I would recommend that his Twitter handle is @SachinRekhi. And he's going to be sharing his advice on how to master influencing without authority, which is a very important skill for many of us on product teams. So Sachin, welcome. Super excited to have you. Awesome talk. I really appreciate all the advice that you have there. And I want to jump in. So with the first question was, I can't help but thinking about, early in my product career, at some training into it, we learned about personality theory and Myers-Briggs, and there's Ocean as well, or Big Five. So if you don't like Myers-Briggs, and one of the key dimensions there is introversion versus extroversion, right? And so I can imagine that this idea of influencing authority, having to speak up, having to argue your case, it might be more of a challenge. Some introverts might find that more of a challenge. So I'm wondering if specifically if there's any kind of specific advice for introverts that might feel like it's, like it seems very challenging, like what advice you would have for them, I would ask.
Yeah, great question. I think this is where I often, have sort of talked about these alternative approaches to building influence without authority, because I think a lot of the traditional feedback you hear about how to build influence without authority, frankly, just works really well for extroverts, right? Like this idea that, you should build relationships. You should really focus on having a great relationship with all the key people you want to influence. And you're like, dude, I'm an introvert. Like the last thing I want to do after my 9 to 5, where I feel like I need to talk to people all the time, is go grab beers with my coworkers. That's not really going to bring me energy. And so I think that ends up being challenging. Similarly, this idea of people are like, oh, work on your presence. And we should all work on our presence. But part of this idea is that if we leave it to these sort of things that tend to associate with extroverts, it becomes more difficult for introverts. And what I find is this idea of leveraging this framework of creating a compelling argument by applying a style argument. Actually, it's something that introverts can do. And it's something that they can do independently of having to go talk to a lot of people, because they're applying the right style argument. And I find that because it sort of feels like rigorous and scientific, introverts actually find it a great way to accomplish that. Now, what I will say is that you do need to be leveraging input from various key stakeholders to make your argument very compelling. Like I said, this idea of how do I go talk to my boss to get his perspective on which argument is going to be most effective. And so you still have to do those kinds of things, but that work is helpful because it makes the actual presentation of the meeting that you're ultimately going to have to convince people way more effective in the long run.
Yeah, I got it. Cool. Yeah. Second question, kind of following up to that. One of the topics I found as a new PM, one of the things that can help you, I think, influence without authority is how much credibility you have, right? And if you're the new person on the team, you kind of start out with not much cred, unless it's you come in with some awesome origin story where they're like, oh my gosh, Sachin crushed it at LinkedIn. But usually you have to build your credibility, right? So I'm just curious, what advice do you have for people to build their credibility?
Yeah, great question. So it's one of these things when you're thinking about building your credibility is, I think one of the best approaches to building your credibility is this idea of show your work. And so the idea here is that, oftentimes we have all these concepts in our head and rationale for why we went through and prioritized this on our roadmap, came up with a given solution, and then we're presenting the end result. But to really bring people along, we need them to see what we see. And oftentimes what people fail to do is to show your work on how you got there. And so what's key is, even though it feels like, hey, am I wasting people's time? It's not that at all. That you actually want to create that credibility by showing your work. And so oftentimes I will take this time of hey, I'm trying to convince my designer of something. And I'd be like, oh, by the way, like, do you remember this design principle from, Don Norman? Like, that really kind of stuck to me. And actually, when I'm looking at these two designs, like when I think about his concept of affordances, like I really feel like this design incorporates this concept of affordance better. And that's why we should go with that. And like, I could have just been like, I like design B, right? And like, I could have left it at that.
Totally.
But instead, I like really got into the weeds of why, and I'm showing my work and my rationale. And that's building credibility with my designer. But that same approach works when I'm working with any of the stakeholders and really finding a way to show your work to help them understand, wow, this guy's really thought this through. Or like, that's a really clever approach. So you're not just showing the end result, but the actual quality of the decision-making, which is what ultimately convinces people of credibility.
Yeah, I love that phrase, show your work. I think it's really important. And also the longer I work in product, the more I think why is the most important question that we have to answer. Like, why should we do this feature instead of that feature? Like, why, why? And what you're bringing up also reminds me of kind of problem space versus solution space. People propose solutions all the time. I think we should do this. And it's like, people go, yes, I agree. Or no, I disagree. But the real issue is, like you said, the underlying rationale. And so I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to share your work with people. That's awesome.
Totally.
Yeah. And then one thing, so it's great, if you can kind of use these influencing tools and people come around, they go, oh my gosh, Sachin is so compelling. I agree with what he says. But, oftentimes we do have disagreements. People have disagreements, like you said. I'm curious, when I was at Intuit doing some training, I was super excited when I learned about this thing called the ladder of influence, which like helps break down why people have different ideas. And it's kind of what you were touching on. It's like, well, maybe we're operating from different data. You have some data that I don't have, and that's why you're doing that. Or you're filtering the data differently. Or to your point, you have different goals, So yeah, I'm just curious if it kind of seems like a similar kind of concept to what you were talking about.
Totally. Yeah. No, I agree that like there's a lot of kind of leverage there as well.
Yeah, cool. And then, we try our best, but then we might still have, we try our best to influence someone, but at the end of the day, it's like, I totally hear you. You've respectfully presented your argument. You've created psychological safety for me, Sachin. Thank you, but I just disagree with you, and what if you feel like, well, gosh, it's a really important decision and I don't think it should go that way. So how do you handle situations when there's just conflict or strong difference of opinion? What's your advice for people in those situations?
Yeah. So like, I think like, we talked a lot about this at LinkedIn and trying to improve our decision-making process. And part of it is more organizational about like, how do you actually have this debate in a way that's constructive? And actually, we even introduced this concept of a clean escalation inside the company, right? And it was actually a very effective concept. And it's this idea that like, let's say two VPs disagree with each other and they have a fundamental difference of opinion and like they can't coalesce on an answer, or one gets to an answer that they really don't like. It's okay to escalate, but you want to do it in a clean way. In this idea that we're going to escalate, in that case, maybe even to the CEO or the VP of product, we'll escalate to them. We'll both take our ideas to this person. We'll both have a chance to give our own perspective on it, but then we'll ask them to make a call. They get paid the big bucks to make these calls, and that's what they're supposed to do. And I think this is the issue where too often we think of escalation as a dirty word, and we're like, it is when you do a dirty escalation, right? Like you go behind someone's back and you try to like get them to overturn the decision without hearing the other guy's argument. We found that actually making clean escalations okay and encouraging it was actually really helpful. It made decision-making faster because we were moving to a world where people were just festering before it, not liking what's going, dragging their feet. And now you're kind of like, no, let's bring this to a higher paid authority to make the call, but we'll both make our compelling argument as much as possible. Yeah,
no, it's funny, the clean versus dirty escalation. Yeah, I've worked in places, it's funny, it's like a cultural attribute of how okay is it to escalate things, and do people do that? And to your point, I've seen plenty of organizations where people just fester because they're like, we disagree and I don't know what to do. I'm banging my head against a wall. So yeah, so I think that's interesting. If you can escalate, if you're in a culture where you can escalate, People are reluctant to escalate, it seems, though. There's always this reluctance to escalate, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's very real. I think that at least at LinkedIn, they sort of organizationally decided we should solve for this. But I'd say the lightweight way is, testing the waters with your own manager and being like, hey, couldn't get to agreement with this guy. I'm wondering what the best way to approach it is. Would you be open to having a chat with both of us? Because we'd love your opinion and perspective on this as well. And part of it is sort of getting at, are they receptive to that? Or are they like, dude, I'm getting involved. I thought you guys would just handle this. And I think people fear the latter, but actually oftentimes managers are trying to find opportunities to get involved without micromanaging. And these are the kind of opportunities we want to bring to them.
Right. But I think in the two examples you brought up, there's a difference. Like when you're VPs and there's no higher to go except the CEO, you have a clear tiebreaker. Many of the people on our call today in our meeting are like lower level PMs. They can escalate to their manager, as you said, but their manager can't dictate what the engineer lead says. So it's almost like you have to escalate to your manager and their manager. And a clean escalation would be like, hey, the four of us, let's get in a room. Let's present our arguments. Let's see if you two can agree. And then if not, you need to go another layer up and up the chain, I guess. But yeah, cool.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly how we defined it at LinkedIn.
Right.
You bring those cross-functional bosses together, see if they can come to an agreement. If they can't, then they can go up to a level. And even just having that framework and language, most of the time it went up one level and a call was made. It never had to go higher.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I think the key is a call gets made. It's almost like in the two VPs going to CEO, it's like, yeah, of course you're rooting for your idea, but you just want to be unblocked. Like, can we just move on? We have fundamental different opinions. Somebody who's empowered make a decision so we can move on. So that's cool.
Yeah, the thing I'll add to that is you bring up a really important point. I didn't talk about it in this talk, but I talk about it in others with this idea of disagree and commit, where ultimately when you do make the call, you want people to disagree and commit, being like, okay, I know that all my opinions were heard. I know that we've all debated it out, but now I need to commit to the solution and just start cranking and start executing on it. Because if we're going to constantly revisit this, it's not going to be helpful. Now, that being said, there are good reasons to revisit decisions. And I think you want to be clear on what that is. For me, the bar is what new information do we now have that we didn't have when we made this initial decision that might cause us to revisit it. And it's sort of like, when you think about sort of the Supreme Court taking an appeal, it's sort of like holding themselves to, should we even take this appeal? Or is it not worth revisiting because we thought the initial, decision was sound? You want to hold that bar and literally ask when someone's like, I don't really agree with this. What new information is available? And really see if it's new, or is it just rehashing the stuff you've already talked about?
Right. No, the whole time you were talking, I was thinking of disagree and commit. I'm like, it's super easy. You escalate, a call gets made, then it's like, are people really committing? The losing party, is the losing party really committing? Are they bitter and still going to try to sabotage or continue to fight the thing, right? So, and as we know, good product teams disagree and commit. You get on board. Cool. Well, and in the process, we talk about influence. We're talking about this, and I do think I love the focus on decision making. I think a lot of product management is driving good organizational decision making. That's what your job is about. And it involves getting buy-in. The way I think about is getting buy-in, like you were saying, so all the tips you had about social proof and other things. When I think about it, it almost at some point it started sounding like a bill like politics. We need to build a coalition. And and it makes me think about what's the ideal order, the optimal order to talk to which people. Should I talk to the engineer first? Should I talk to the designer first? You know what I mean? And in my world, I developed a view of that called expanding concentric circles. You pick who's in the first inner circle, and then once I get their buy-in, I expand the circle and I include the next person. And ideally, it's kind of one at a time. One of the mistakes I see people make is, let's get everybody in a room and we'll just hammer this out. And it makes me think of the movie 12 Angry Men, right? Where they're all just like, there's no way, right? So I'm just wondering, when you've got multiple people that you've got to get buy-in from, what tips do you have for people on how to think about and navigate getting buy-in from multiple people?
Totally. And I think it's one of these things that I completely agree with you, sort of I take a similar concentric circle approach to this, where it's trying to figure out who are we really trying to convince? And so like, in my mind, like when I think about most product decisions, like if we start with sort of a typical kind of product design work, you have your like co-creators, right? Like that's your product team. You're working with your designer, your engineer, you're coming up with the ideas, and those the co-creators. And the thing is, when you're engaging with your co-creators, you engage with them deeply, right? Because when they have an idea and you disagree with it, you need to rebut it. You need to like basically be like, hey man, I disagree for these reasons, and try to bring them along to your own side. So the cost of engagement with a co-creator is very high. That's why you want to keep that sort of audience of co-creators like very small, of literally just the designer, the engineer, or that small V team that you've created. Now, you certainly want to have the larger brainstorm with the bigger team, and that's always helpful. But these folks are really collaborators in that they're going to give you feedback. You want to understand that feedback, and then you can go off and decide like, hey, what am I going to go do, right? So if we're doing a brainstorm with like the 15-person engineering team, I don't have to rebut every single idea I disagree with. I can just take that feedback, then prioritize it, and then figure out ultimately what do I want to accomplish. And then finally, you have these influencers, these folks that want to be kept abreast of the decision-making process, might actually have some feedback, but realistically, you don't need them in the room when you're doing the actual brainstorm. And those folks, you probably just keep up to speed via email or Slack and really just say, hey guys, here's the current thinking, here's the brainstorm list, here's where we're headed. And if they have feedback, they can chime in, but you're not explicitly soliciting that feedback. So that's where I think about sort of the core of most product decisions. Now, ultimately, you have a subset of decisions that do go up to senior management. Maybe it's a product review and whatnot. And in those cases, you ideally want to warm up the room before you get there, right? Like hopefully maybe your boss is there and your boss has already bought off on the idea. Maybe there's one other stakeholder that you've had a chance to sort of get feedback on and incorporate them in. I remember like when I was at Microsoft starting early in my career, I ended up doing the worst possible thing, which was the first time anyone was seeing this was the 24 hours before the pre-read. And then when I came in, everyone was throwing up all over my product spec. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so painful. And it's because I didn't do the work of really trying to build some consensus beforehand. And it turned out they had a lot of legitimate concerns that I should have incorporated well before we got to the review meeting. And part of the feedback was I went in blind, and that's when you're not really kind of leveraging the decision-making process the way you should.
Yeah, and it's, it makes me think of like, Congress people walking around going, hey, Sachin, are you going to vote for my bill? Hey, kind of like before you do the vote, you kind of know the outcome of the vote. Or like before you go into the meeting, you should kind of know which way it's leaning, right? We have to make a decision and, you should kind of know. So I guess a yellow flag is if you're going into a meeting, you have no idea where people are at. That's a yellow flag that you haven't done the pre-work, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And now this makes you also think about, we're talking about getting, decision-making with multiple stakeholders and stuff. It makes me think, I don't know if you've ever used like DACY or RACY or RASCI, those. So, and I know for people that don't know
at LinkedIn.
Oh, Rapid. Yeah, there's a million acronyms, right? But basically, and I know at Intuit, we use DACY, which was like driver, approver, consult, and form, which was good so that for any major project, you would define who's the driver of this. Usually it was the PM for product stuff. Who's the approver? It would be someone from like a PM leader, an engineering leader, a design leader. And then who's the consult? Who do we need to like get their input? Like that's what we think about it. You're like, I'm going to get your input, but I don't have to listen to it if I don't want to. That's consults. And then who is informed. So I'm curious if you have any advice for people. I find that a lot of places don't use those frameworks. I'm just curious if you have any advice for people on those kind of things.
Yeah, so we used Rapids at LinkedIn, and I think they were effective at the time because of the fact that like we were feeling a lot of decision-making pain, and we were feeling like decisions were moving slowly. We felt like we were kind of in this org of consensus-driven decisions. And so we instituted these concepts like Rapids as well as clean escalation to try to solve for it. So the challenge with the Rapid, it's even just hard to remember what each of these things stand for. And it's pretty complicated. And so, and then you get sort of into negotiation. Well, who's the real D here?
I know.
And so I've really tried to simplify it in this idea of like co-creators, collaborators, and influencers.
Totally.
to make it a little bit kind of something that you can leverage, even if you don't have a formal framework that you're using within your organization.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I've heard people say who's got the D and stuff for rapid. And it just ends up, if you have too many, and I'll just say one thing for people out there, if you're going to use it and there's like Daisy or Racy, the other thing I've found, because I've done a lot of workshops with teams, so they're essentially the same, Daisy and Racy. The only difference is the D stands for driver and the R stands for responsible. Now, in Racy, A stands for accountable. So I don't know about you, but when I hear responsible and accountable, those sounds like synonyms. And so it causes all kinds of confusion in those teams. And that's why long story short, just use Daisy. The driver is like, who's actually responsible for driving things forward? They don't get to make the decisions. Anyway, so Daisy over Racy all day. Cool. And then I really love Elements of Style reference. I like that book. I like how you tie it in and how you tied it into that. And you shared your elements of style for an effective argument. You may not have any. I'm just curious, like, do you have any other elements of style that apply to PMs or any other philosophies or kind of things like that beyond effective arguments for PMs in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, there are a bunch of sort of soft skills that I think PMs need to get really good at. I think one of the ones I've written a bit about is sort of this concept of developing empathy. That like actually as product managers, I think sometimes we get away looking at data too much relative to really kind of empathizing with our end users. And not only with our end users, but with the other stakeholders within our organization, right? And so that soft skill of building empathy is something that I think is also sort of more stylistic than it is sort of a hard skill. And I don't mean like just execute usability studies or field studies. Like that's a part of it, that's important. But really sort of steeping yourself in the mentality of your end user or whoever the stakeholder might be, and really trying to back out what's their real motivation here, right? Not just what they're trying to accomplish, but what's their motivations? What's their why? Why are they doing this in the first place? And so I think there's a bunch of things there where really great PMs are sort of masters of empathy and can not only understand that empathy, but then can start articulating the motivations and the why around their end users to others that allows your other stakeholders in your team to better understand those end users.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think empathy is super important. I think you need to have customer empathy, which is what we're talking about. I also feel like it kind of affects your influence without authority. Just like you're going to put yourself in the customer's shoes, put yourself in the engineer's shoes. What does he or she care about? When I'm about to go to talk to them, they're probably going to care about, like you said, citation and data and logic, right? I'm going to go talk to the designer. What are they going to care about? So I feel like you've got to constantly like put yourself in other people's shoes to do our job, because we kind of sit in the middle. We're the customer champion, but also we sit in the middle of these other functions, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that empathy with the stakeholders that you're working with on a day-to-day basis is equally important as it is with your end users.
Yeah, cool. And then, I'm realizing looking at your background, you've got this awesome background. You worked at larger companies like Microsoft and LinkedIn as it was growing. You've also clearly been an entrepreneur, worked a lot of startups. I'm curious if there are any differences, like what are the general patterns that you see, like as far as like influencing authority? Is it easier in small companies? Is it harder? Like what are the key differences if you're doing this in a smaller startup versus a larger company?
Great question. I mentor a lot of PMs on this idea of like, what company do I think I'm going to thrive in? A smaller company, a larger company, an early stage company, a fast growing company. And I think it's important to really start to understand this stuff about yourself. You will find the big difference that people talk about between these two companies is that when you're at a smaller organization, you will see that you have less resources as a PM, right? So you end up doing more yourself. Versus at a larger company, you have a lot of experts you can work with to get things done. So to make that concrete, when I was at LinkedIn, when I wanted to do user research, I had a UX researcher that I'd be paired with, that would be responsible for reviewing and coming up with the script that we would ask. And he has all this anti-bias training to ensure that when he asks questions, he doesn't do it in a leading way. We even had a separate market research team that knew how to design surveys in a way that they were quantitatively accurate.
Right.
Now at NoChoy, what happens, I come up with a script myself. Like I open up SurveyMonkey and I create a survey to go send, right? There's no resources to leverage. And so it creates a very different dynamic. I'm still doing the same research, doing the same work, but I don't have the experts to leverage. And the thing to realize is this is really a personal decision about where you thrive. Because on one hand, you may love working with these experts because you get to really up your game and work with world-class people, and you're not in the weeds of learning how to use a survey tool or whatnot. You get resources that you can leverage to go guso. That being said, influence with authority becomes way more important in those settings, because now you can't just be like, hey, UX researcher, here's what I think, let's do it this way. No, they have a whole perspective. And in fact, they're the expert. And so now you have to convince them when they're the expert of running the actual research project. And so I have plenty of other PMs that are like, oh my gosh, I'd rather just run the thing myself. Not only both from I don't want to deal with coordinating between a lot of people, but I also like to get my hands dirty, right? And so like I often encourage people early in their career to sort of figure out, try both. Ideally, try a large organization, an established tech company. And I actually encourage most people to try that first, because you're getting some learning to actually build like your skill set, and then try a smaller company. And like smaller could be anything like, mine are sort of extreme cases where I founded a company with just a couple of guys. But even like a 50-person startup is very different than a large established tech company. And try them both, and then start to think about, where do you think you thrive? And like, it's okay to be like, okay, I actually like the resources of a larger company. That's what I prefer. I might need to work on influence with authority. So I've identified that as a skill gap that I want to go build, but I still prefer having those resources. So I'm going to kind of build my career around that. Or I'm going to realize, no, that's not really for me. Now, that being said, the one caveat I want to suggest is it's not so simple as like, you need more influence with authority as a large company than a smaller company. In a smaller company, you also have very strong, very involved founders, especially when you're talking under 50 employees. And those folks like have deep opinions, and they need to be convinced if you're going to go any other way, versus in a larger company, many of those decisions might be delegated to you. And so there's trade-offs there. Yeah,
no, definitely. That's interesting. Yeah, it's funny. I agree. It's like if you have, it's good to experience both in your career. Experience a large company, experience a larger company, experience each smaller company, so you can see the differences and decide what's best for you. And of the two choices, like large first and then small, or small and then large, I totally agree with you. Go to large because you're going to learn. Like you were at Microsoft, I was at Intuit. We also, like I to this day, I'm so grateful. We had a PhD in market research on our marketing team. I learned all about surveys and qualitative research from her. And I'm glad. And to your point, I would just defer to what she said. I wouldn't challenge her or anything because she knew way better than me. But then you learn it and you can take it to the smaller company. Whereas I feel like if you go into a smaller company first, you're kind of getting thrown in the deep end of the pool with not many resources. Probably don't have a mentor, probably don't have a coach. So anyway, awesome, cool. Well, thank you very much for the fireside chat, Sachin. Let's switch over to audience Q&A. We have several questions from folks here. Vipin Tyagi, I think you might have just had your video on. So Vipin, if you want to unmute and put on your video, you're more than welcome to come in and ask your question of Sachin.
Hey, hi Sachin. It's a great session so far, and it's a great learning. My question is around managing the tech team. So you will see that, tech or team, they are like a smart folks. So they know the tech better, and they also have a vision. Sometimes that vision is not aligned with the product vision. And I have seen many cases where there's a lot of conflict happening because of that. Because you might be a new guy coming into the team, and the tech guys might be there for quite a long time, and they see how the product should evolve. So what is your take on that? Like, how to manage the expectation and the stakeholders in those cases?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a couple of techniques that can be helpful in that case. I've used a bunch of them in this case as well. Like I remember when I had joined a team at Microsoft. This is my first job out of college. And I was a PM on this very technical product. We were working on Visual Studio, so developer tools. And we had this great director of engineering that knew this space cold. And so I had come up with a brand new feature to attempt to really kind of revolutionize the way we were doing this thing. And I had like presented it at this meeting that this director of engineering was in, and he just threw up all over it and basically hated the idea. And he was also like, sort of like, dude, like, we're the technical engineers on this very technical product. Like, we really know what we're building. This is kind of off the mark. Let's not move in this direction. And so that was painful for me, because it was like, I thought I'd put all this effort into trying to, get them convinced to go my idea. And, after kind of talking about that experience with my boss was like, well, you have to realize you're dealing with, a very senior engineering leader. There's egos involved of, been around longer than me, been at Microsoft for 15 years. Here's this new guy coming in. And you really have to think about what's the right way to accomplish, your goal of getting this person convinced. In that case, like, I had to use Inception. Frankly, this is where I came up with the idea of Inception, that this had to be co-creation. This couldn't be me being like, here's what we should do. We need to co-create the solution with that leader. And that's the only way I was going to get leverage to do anything. And so I literally went back to back to square one. And like, I remember going to the manager and being like, hey, look, you're right. You have a lot of great feedback and wisdom on this. Would you mind if we got together and had a brainstorming session on this? And then we just got on the whiteboard. We started talking about ideas, and he was giving me his opinions. And I was asking leading questions on like, hey, we're hearing this kind of feedback from our customers. Like, how could we incorporate that into here? Or once he got comfortable that I was actually listening to him, he started being more okay with me sharing my own ideas and perspectives. And so we ended up with a solution that was sort of a combination of some of his ideas and some of my new ideas, which is probably better off for the end user. But that co-creation technique, Inception, was really key. Now, once you've done that and you sort of like establish yourself on the team, I think it does make sense, especially when you're like a PM coming in, to then have this exercise of like, hey guys, we've been making some incremental wins, but like, can we revisit our vision? Can we have a brainstorming exercise and do a workshop so we can come up with a vision that really takes into account everything we've learned since the last time we established this, and really build alignment across the team? And then oftentimes the PM can help facilitate that process. And now you're again co-creating, but then you're really trying to bring the team along to a new vision that could ultimately be kind of a shared vision across the team, not just as the existing vision that exists within a certain subset of stakeholders like the engineering audience.
Yeah, that helps, Sachin. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Great, awesome. Thanks for your question, Vipin. Next up, we have Jamil Dusi. Jamil, there we go.
Sachin, always nice to hear your sessions.
Yeah, great to see you.
You too. I just wanted to hear a few tips around how a PM can adapt their style when they're engaging in healthy debate with folks in sales or support or even engineering, and some of the tips you've learned along the way.
Yeah, great question. So, I think the reality is you do have multiple audiences that you need to convince. And it does turn out, given those multiple audiences, different style elements can work differently. And so, for example, like I remember when I was even pitching the concept of Sales Navigator to the LinkedIn executive team, I got a chance to present at this offsite that was the entire LinkedIn executive team, as well as the board. And so Reid Hoffman was there. And like I knew the key stakeholders I needed to convince was our CEO, Jeff Weiner, and our original founder, Reid Hoffman. But let me tell you, these two people are very different personalities. And in fact, there's a reason Reid ultimately made Jeff the CEO of the company and sort of like stepped down as CEO, because Jeff is a fantastic operator. But his operation skills come from his analytical rigor. And so he's all about the metrics. He's all about the data, and can often see stuff in data before you can. And so I knew to convince him a data-driven argument is going to be probably the most effective way to go do that. Now, someone like Reid is like a big end user thinker, right? He wants to think about like and he's thinking about the product he founded, which is LinkedIn. So how is the world going to be a better place with a product like Sales Navigator, right? And there's a lot of reasons to be worried about a product like Sales Navigator being introduced to the LinkedIn ecosystem. What if you just end up spamming a lot of the end users? That's not a good experience for everyone. And so we knew he would want to be convinced that the end user impact was going to be good. And frankly, he didn't care about the metrics. He didn't care if we made $1 billion on Sales Navigator if it came at the cost of the core network. And so no data argument was going to be helpful. It's really about how do we shape the product strategy in a way that aligns with the end user experience. And so we really had to do a dual strategy where we, in that conversation, because it was one presentation, had to actually try to convince them both. And so we went in with both metric-based data where we had it. It was rough because it was a new product, so there was limited data. But then we also had how our philosophy aligned with members first. And so we tried to capture both of these elements of style. Now, that's a case where you're actually in the same meeting with both stakeholders. Now, oftentimes the reality is that you're meeting sort of more one-on-one with each of these set of people, right? So like you might be meeting with customer success and really working through a bunch of issues with them. You might be meeting with sales and working through a bunch of issues with them. In that case, I do find it necessary to really sort of customize your pitch based on an element style to them, right? Because oftentimes with sales, sort of like often data-driven arguments just don't work as well, right? Because they're like very much excited about this very specific deal that they're really much focused on. And so you're really trying to convince them, like, how does this align with our strategy? Those arguments tend to work well. But a lot of this is personality-based. Like, who's the specific person that you're talking to and what ultimately is going to be the most successful for them? And so when you're thinking about your argument, you often have to presuppose multiple styles that you could use for the same argument, but have them in your back pocket, right? Like, I think the way we often thought about this is sort of backup and appendix slides, right? Like, and then we decide which ones we pop up into the main deck based on like who we were talking to. We literally did this for a lot of the Sales Navigator pitches when we were internally socializing Sales Navigator. Not only did I have to convince the leadership team, but I need the marketing team bought off on, okay, we're going to completely throw out your entire roadmap and instead focus on this new stuff. And so, thinking about how you can leverage different styles is a reality of the fact when you're kind of working in an organization with so many different personalities.
Got it. Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right, cool. So next up we have Tanuka Patel. Tanuka, if you want to unmute and put your video on, you can ask your question. Hi.
Yes, Dan. Yeah. First of all, it was an incredible session. I must say that, thank you so much, Sachin, for that. And I would also like to say that you indirectly answered my question while talking about the story, the offsite story, LinkedIn. However, I would like to dig a little deeper in that. Just to give you a little context, I work for a mammoth-sized enterprise corporation, and what happens in these companies is there are different people solving the same problems at the same time, and there's no way basically to find out, and they. They're very protective about their work, and you kind of do not find it out till the last moment when you are in a meeting room with all the different stakeholders and they kind of start arguing with each other, and it's very difficult to come out of that room with a consensus. What are some of the strategies that you can kind of tell us in those kind of scenarios?
Yeah, great question. So, I think in large organizations, it's not uncommon to end up in a world where there's multiple teams working on related efforts, which overlapping efforts. And you're right, like sometimes you don't know about that because of how large the organization is. And so part of it is, trying to create mechanisms first where you can get intel on what's going on, where possible that might be relevant for your team. And this is again where leveraging executives ends up being helpful to try to keep you in the loop. Of course, it's not always possible. And of course, there's going to be multiple initiatives that are happening. But now the question is, now that you have these conversations happening and you're realizing this overlap, how do you resolve it? So I think the key thing is really sort of trying to figure out, what the actionable next steps are for these things and being concrete about it, right? Like I try to end most of my meetings being like, okay, we had this healthy debate around this. Where did we land, right? And first I ask that question if I'm seeing a bunch of my PMs kind of, negotiating with each other, and really to see if they come to some simplified solution. Oftentimes they don't. And then we get into a discussion of what are the next steps here? Like, how do we turn this into a reality? How do we get to some decision? And I think it's sort of both framing what is the decision that really needs to be made very concretely, right? Because you don't want to boil the ocean. Like, yes, we may have two overlapping efforts. Are we really trying to solve that problem? Or are we trying to just get this specific team greenlit and moving forward on a given initiative? And what's the problem that needs to be solved to get to that? And so narrowly focusing on what the problem you need to solve to ultimately get those next steps, and then being concrete about realistically, what are the next steps to be had, right? And sometimes it's doing additional research. Sometimes it's getting the right stakeholders in the room for a subsequent conversation. Sometimes if you know it's not ultimately going to lead to a discussion, it's framing it as, okay, we're going to frame up our arguments, and then we're going to bring it to a senior leader as a clean escalation. And so you have sort of a two-step process that you're framing up as the next steps. But I think the key thing here is to not leave it as an unresolved issue, but try to get to the point either in the meeting or after, if you can't, to what the reasonable next steps are to get to a resolution that people can agree to at least the steps, even if they disagree on the actual ideas or merits of the argument.
That helps. Thank you so much.
Tanuka, thank you for your question. Next up, we have Pian. You want to ask if you want to unmute and turn on your video, feel free to ask your question. Hey, there you are.
Hello.
How's it going?
Hey, good. How are you? Hey, Sachin and Dan.
Hey, great to see you.
Good to see you too. I'm curious, how did you learn all the things you just talked about today? My startup, Emotions, actually focused on helping people develop soft skills. It's pretty early on, just founded it. So really curious to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So what I'd say is that I think it's a twofold thing. One, I've learned most of my lessons the hard way. Just like I mentioned the story of Microsoft, I can't tell you how devastating it is to see a senior leader within the organization just shoot down your idea. And so a lot of these are battle scars that I've had that I've ultimately had to figure out, how do I actually get past this? Now, the key to getting past it was a set of mentors and coaches that I've been able to take my very specific problem to and solve for it. So in my specific case, with the Microsoft example, I had this phenomenal boss, Stephanie Saad, that I literally went into her office incredibly upset after this meeting and being like, what did I do wrong? And she was realistic. She's like, Sachin, you are very upset right now. Now is not the time to have this conversation. Go home. We will have this conversation tomorrow. And, even that was valuable feedback because it turns out I wasn't in the mood. I just wanted to, mouth off my head of engineering, right? And so I came back after that and we talked about the specific challenges in the room. And yeah, we acknowledged that we were dealing with specific personalities, but we talked a lot about what strategies could I leverage to be more successful. What has Stephanie done herself in these situations to solve for kind of the challenges that she's faced? Sorry, that's my dog. So that was number one. But over time, what's been interesting is it hasn't been my manager, but actually, I've actually been leveraging a lot my wife, who's in my corner, Ada, because it turns out some people are just have higher EQ, right? And are just better at some of these ideas of how do you actually build rapport with other people? How do you make a successful argument? And like, I've now learned these skills myself really well, but oftentimes it'd be me coming back from LinkedIn, going and talking to Adam, and I'm like, man, I had this like terrible conversation with this person. Like, they seem unconvinced. Like, and most of it is me venting, which is also needed. But then it's her being like, well, have you tried this? Here's some other strategies you can use. And if you can have someone in your corner, and like I said, a mentor is great. It could be, your spouse, your sibling. It could be anyone that you can get. It could be a peer that you just have these regular dinners with, that you kind of share your own problems. That ends up being a great outlet, especially when they complement you in skill set, to help you solve for building up your own skill set for kind of doing this well.
So it sounds like important to have some kind of like community or people that you can work with on these things.
Yeah. And I think part of it is like, you need that same concept of psychological safety, right? Like, I think part of it is like, when you talk about large communities, it's problematic because it's like, well, am I really going to kind of air my dirt on what's going on with my manager, like in this setting? So you need that psychological safety where you feel like it's safe for you to do so with specific people that you end up building rapport with. And so I find that actually like, when you can do this with individuals that you really kind of build a relationship with, that you can regularly meet with, that ends up being super valuable.
Thank you. We'll try to create that kind of environment and in the emotions. Thanks.
Awesome.
All right, cool. Yeah. And I would just add, like, yeah, I also lean on my wife for difficult situations. I'll be like, hey, honey, sometimes just getting a second opinion from a friend, right? Just like, hey, and they'll see something that you didn't see, right? They'll see some aspect of it that you didn't think about, or they may tell you, hey, you just need to like cool off for an hour and then revisit it. So awesome, Sachin. I want to thank Sachin once again for being here and taking the time to share his advice with us. It's super helpful. So thanks a lot, Sachin.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Good to see you guys.